The Perfect Gentleman by Edgar Wallace. Mrs. 𝒉𝒓𝒂𝒔 really reached her decision long before her legacy came, and when she was just plain Mrs. Wainford, the widow of a very gallant officer who had died fighting on the Somme. Plain Mrs. Wainford she had never been. At 20, she was beautiful. At 35, hers was that ethereal loveliness which would have inspired poets had she lived in a poetic age. The news of Willie's death had shocked her, or rather, she was shocked by her own attitude. For the first sensation had been one of incredible relief. It was a painful shutting down of an unpleasant story. The magnificent heroism of his passing should have wiped out all bitterness, memories of crude infidelities, of shameless dishonesty, of that one open-handed blow he had struck her. But somehow these ugly pictures remained in her mind, and then came Slick, handsome, tall, debonair, a young man who met trouble, for which he was mainly responsible, with a smile. She thought she loved him. She was sure he loved her. There was no earthly reason why they should not marry. Marriage stood for bondage in her mind, and the prospect was not alluring. Yet she would have married Slick. Her real humiliation was that he had always found a good reason against such a course, and Slick Dawlish became involved in the Maidstone baccarat scandal and narrowly escaped prosecution. Misfortunes do not come singly. Within a month, he figured in yet another unsavory affair. One of his horses was most palpably pulled. There followed an inquiry, and a few weeks later that deadly notice in the racing calendar. Following upon an injury by the stewards of the Jockey Club into the running of Dictionnaire, the stewards warned Mr. Basil Wyndon Dawlish off Newmarket Heath. Slick read the announcement with some amusement and got on to the telephone to his friend. Apparently she had read about it in the evening newspaper. "I suppose I'd better pop off to the continent somewhere, Bunny. What do you say to a trip?" "You go alone, Slick." The voice was very cold, very even. For a moment he was shaken out of his indifference. There is no need to put on record his expostulations, the story of his many journeys to Cheyne House, only to find that Mrs. Wainford was out. 5 years passed. The 𝒉𝒂𝒂𝒔 fortune and the 𝒉𝒂𝒂𝒔 diamonds came to Bunny Wainford. He read one day the announcement that she had changed her name by deed poll and went smiling to bed. He had been up all night trimming an opulent young guardsman who had the misfortune to sit in a game with him. Slick's manipulation of a pack of cards was his most amazing accomplishment. He used to read of her movements in the society columns of the newspapers. Mrs. 𝒉𝒂𝒂𝒔, the widow of a very gallant officer. When he read this, he laughed till the tears came into his eyes, for Slick had a secret, which he shared with none. They met occasionally, but he paid no further visit to the flat until a certain 24th of December. The dinner had been a good one. The game which followed had been short and profitable. Slick came out of the club, which was not too particular as to its membership, feeling at peace with the world. How much of his benignity was traceable to that excellent 19 wine and that marvelous old brandy, and how much to his momentary affluence, it may be difficult to separate. He hailed a cab with a lordly gesture, his first intention being to go home to his flat in St. James Street. Yet, when the cabman asked for orders, "Cheyne House, Chelsea Embankment," he said. The cabman drew a long face. "The fog's thick along the Thames, sir. I've only just come from Westminster." Slick was dimly conscious that the fog was thick where he stood, a yellow blinding mist through which the street lamps glowed wanly. "Cheyne House," he repeated, and got in. Their progress was slow. Somewhere in the region of Chelsea, as they guessed rather than knew, the cabman stopped and Slick got out. "The Embankment can't be very far from here, sir," and added, "It's a wonderful night for the cat." At the moment, Slick was not interested in fashionable burglars, though the cat's exploits had been a general topic of conversation at most of the dinner tables he had visited in the past week or two. "All right," he said, and paid the cabman magnificently. He had a knowledge of topography and a surprising memory. He remembered, for example, certain big acorn-shaped rail tops that surrounded a museum, and when, groping in the dark, he felt one of these, his progress to Cheyne House was simplified. It was 5 years since he had put his foot inside that flat of hers. If she was rotten to him, he could go away again. After all, a fellow had an excuse for calling at this season of the year. He had still got her key on his ring. He ought to return that. Perhaps the hall porter would not admit him. He wished he could climb like a cat bird, and chuckled for a long time at the thought of the surprise it would give Bunny. He was not quite sober. Marjorie the maid opened the door to him. Her face was a little pallid. One hand was behind her. "Oh, Mr. Dawlish," she gasped, and seemed very relieved. She opened the door wider. "Won't you come in?" He walked into the lighted hall, hung up his hat and coat, and followed the girl, who backed before him, into the drawing room, the same room, but beautifully decorated. The furniture was new, terribly expensive. The lamp brackets on the wall were of silver. The glass chandelier was new. He grinned. "Mrs. 𝒉𝒓𝒂𝒔 is out," said the girl. "She went to the theatre with Lady Lorford." "Oh," he stroked his chin gravely, saw that the maid's hand was still behind her. "What have you got there?" he asked. Silently she produced the thing she was holding, a small poker. "Are you expecting a friend?" he asked good-humoredly. It was the cat burglar she feared. Her defensive attitude was not an unusual phenomenon. Had not old Mrs. Curter recently invested in a large navy revolver to protect her emeralds? And that pink-faced woman who lived with somebody or other, he couldn't remember whom, invested in police whistles and burglar alarms. The maid was talking. "It's like out of a book, isn't it? Fancy a burglar wearing evening dress." "Good Lord," said Slick, "all burglars wear evening dress some time or another. It's part of their punishment." He walked to the French windows, opened them with some difficulty, and stepped out onto the balcony. Below was unrelieved murkiness. "It's a ghastly night, eh? Get me a spot." She went out and came back with a tray, and he helped himself liberally, though he remembered that whiskey goes badly on top of champagne. Now that the maid had recovered herself, she remembered certain prohibitions, and was a little uneasy. This he detected, and he anticipated the cause. "Excuse me, sir, Madame will be rather angry, won't she, when she finds you here?" He was looking at her. Marjorie had got older. All the bloom had gone. He took a pack of cards from his pocket, and, sitting down to a little table, began to shuffle and cut, almost mechanically. "Marjorie, do you remember the old times when nobody had a bob in the world?" he added. "I bet they've put up the rent for this flat since I left. Somebody told me Shane House had become quite fashionable." He offered the cards to the girl. "Cut," he said laconically. She hesitated and presently obeyed, a little awkwardly, a little timidly. He dealt 5 cards quickly to her and 5 to himself. "Don't pick them up," he said. "You've got 3 aces and 2 kings." And when she turned the cards up, he roared with laughter. "I learnt that at Sunday school," he said, and suddenly bent his head, listening. "There's a car." He opened the window again and walked onto the balcony, and presently heard the whine and rattle of an ancient machine. A taxi. He came back, closing the window, and found the girl still waiting a little apprehensively. "Mr. Dawlish, I wish you'd try to persuade Madame to keep her jewels at the safe deposit," she said. "It terrifies me having these diamonds in the flat, and everybody knowing that she's got them here. There was a bit in the paper the other night. I cut it out." She searched the mantelpiece where apparently she had deposited the cutting. He took the slip from her hand and read, "Mrs. 𝒉𝒂𝒂𝒔 is one of the society women who do not fear the cat burglars. Most ladies would keep the Cam diamonds in a bank, but Mrs. 𝒉𝒂𝒂𝒔 prefers the security of her own safe." "Silly," was his comment. "She's asking for it." "With this burglar around," began the girl, and then the bell rang. Slick poured himself out another whiskey. He heard Bunny's voice, the click of an opening door, but did not look around. He knew she was standing in the doorway surveying him, and guessed that the survey had in it nothing of approval. Presently he turned his eyes. "Come in, Bunny, don't stand on ceremony, we're all friends here," he said. She was lovely. He expected nothing less. Lovelier than he had ever seen her. She took off her wrap and handed it to Marjorie. "I will ring when Mr. Dawlish has gone, which will be very soon," she added. And when the door had closed on the maid, "Did you come to see me or Marjorie?" He laughed quietly. "Your tastes are so catholic that one is never sure. Tea-shop waitresses, grass widows ready for the haymaker, chorus girls." Her shrug completed the category. And widow ladies down on their luck, eh? Said Slick, amused. She walked to the little settee near the fire and sat down, offering her cold hands to the blaze. I deserved that, she said without looking up, but I thought you could resist the temptation. Marjorie tells me you did have the decency to ring. You have never returned the key. He was on the point of telling her that it was in his pocket. Instead, lost it, said Slick. She looked at him thoughtfully. You haven't improved. When my little reformer got tired of improving me, I lost interest, he said flippantly. She might have told him that it was impossible to improve a man who would rather steal than work. I often wonder why you didn't turn cat burglar, she said. It is the fashionable branch of your profession. He shivered. Cat burglar, any kind of burglar, horrible life, out of doors in all kinds of beastly weather, climbing up spouts, ugh. She smiled faintly. Card sharping is easier, picking up stupid young men of your own class and fleecing them, he laughed. You're frightfully amusing tonight. What have you been seeing? A musical comedy? Not that that would depress you. You can't hurt my feelings, Bunny darling. Her shoulders moved imperceptibly. Then as his hand strayed to the decanter, Don't drink any more, Slick. Call me Basil, he mocked her. Basil! Fancy giving me a name like that. No wonder I went wrong. He splashed some soda into the glass. If they'd christened me Percy, I'd have had a chance. Where did you get the name Slick? She asked him, and it occurred to her that it was amazing she had never asked that question before. At school, he began, and stopped short. When I was a kid. She almost gasped with astonishment at her discovery. She had known him all these years, and for the first time in her life, she had discovered his raw spot. I wonder what they'd think of you at your school now, she asked innocently, and saw the scowl gather on his face and guessed she was right. Here was the chink in his armor. I don't want to discuss my school, he said gruffly. Do you mind? We'll keep that out of the conversation. She looked at him in amused wonder. That's your tender spot, is it? I never knew that before. The perfect gentleman, she mimicked him. We will not discuss my school, do you mind? We are old Festonians. She saw the angry red come to his face. Drop it, I mean that, he said. She might call him a thief, and he would laugh, a card sharper, and he would be amused. She had called him worse than either, and he had done no more than make her an ironical bow. But at the first reference to his school, Why have you come? She asked quietly. He felt in his pocket, took out a note case, laid 2 banknotes on the table. The last time I saw you, I borrowed a couple of $100. Here they are. She looked at the money contemptuously. Who was the victim? She asked. A fellow from America, said Slick easily. They've got all the money except that bit. He put the cards back. The perfect gentleman, she said. He nodded and smiled. I was good enough for you once, old girl, he said as he reached for the decanter. Her hand fell on his wrist, but he shook it off. You've got foolish ideas, Bunny, he said. You think everybody's honest except the pros. Why, there isn't a club in London that hasn't got its sharps, only they pretend that it's temperament. You know, the feller who wriggles about in his chair, if you don't return his spade, he's a sharp but doesn't know it. She waited, and when he had put down the glass, I don't know that I want you to stay, Slick. I suppose Christmas is the excuse that brought you. Well, I will accept your kind wishes, and now you can go. He tried to take her hand, but she drew back, and then, before she realized what was happening, she was in his arms, and he was kissing her. She broke loose furiously, white as death. You brute, she breathed. Slick Dawlish was not smiling anymore. He stood glowering down at her, his hands in his pocket. Brute, that's my trouble. I've been too gentle with you. If I'd treated you as your husband treated you. We'll leave his name out of it, she cried in a cold fury. Slick, haven't you any decent feeling that you can mention the name of a man who died honorably in action, a man of your own regiment, a man you pretend was a friend of yours? He was off his guard now. Anger, wounded vanity, a tremendous sense of grievance, a desire to hurt as he had been hurt, dominated him to the exclusion of all the considerations which had governed him during all the long years. He was no friend of yours, Bunny, he said brutally. Don't see him in a halo because he passed out. His voice was tremulous with anger. "He never hesitated to take a hunting crop to you. You told me that yourself. Your life was a hell upon earth with him. Don't forget it." "He's dead," she said in a low voice. Slick Dawlish swallowed his whiskey at a gulp. "I'm talking about him alive. You sneer about me being unfaithful, good Lord." And now she turned on him in a fury. "I don't want to hear what you're going to say," she said tensely. "I forgave him all when the news came. You yourself brought it. Have you no shame, no decency? He treated me badly. I never said he didn't. But his sacrifice wiped that out and left him a clean memory. If you had only gone with him." "I'm jolly glad I didn't," said Slick, and his tone infuriated her. The perfect gentleman, the old Festonian. Now he turned with a snarl. "Drop it." "That hurts you," she taunted. "I'd like to print your record on every wall of your old school. I'd like to have a banner on the playing field. Slick Dawlish, an old boy of this school, is a card sharper, a man without honor to comrades living or faith to the dead." He was livid with fury. "Faith to Bill Wainford, that damned coward." He saw her eyes open wide with horror, but nothing could check him now. "I'll tell you, Bill Wainford deserved in the face of the enemy the night before the big push." "That's a lie." "He went to save his skin," he went on remorselessly. "He'd have been court-martialed for robbing the regimental funds if he hadn't. I told the lie about his being killed. I swore I'd seen it. They found out the truth after they'd granted your pension, and they hushed it up." She came nearer and nearer to him, her beautiful face distorted with anger. Then suddenly he felt the sting of her palm on his cheek. "You liar, you horrible liar! Get out!" He was sober now, watched her unmoved and silent as she almost ran to the wall and pressed the bell. Marjorie came in. "Show that man to the door and never let him come in again." Slick Dawlish went out into the fog, stood for a long time by the ornamental wall which surrounded the block, and then, his fingers moving mechanically through his pockets, he touched a key. The key was one of the excuses he had for calling. He must see Bunny again, tell her a lie, swear to her that he had never meant what he said, that old Bill had died honorably. He went upstairs again very slowly. It was nearly half an hour after he had left the flat that he inserted the key and opened the door. The hall was in darkness. In the drawing room, one small globe, overlooked by the maids, still glowed. He was a little muddled now. Incursion into the night air had made his legs curiously weak, and then he heard a queer scratching noise and turned his head toward the curtained window. Crack! He drew back against the wall, and a little later the curtains parted and the bearded face of a man appeared. Who the devil was this? Slick frowned. Was there another man? The intruder was in evening dress, the white front slightly soiled. The cat! As he stepped into the open, Slick Dawlish's hand gripped his collar and swung him round. That left of his was drawn back to strike when, "My gosh, Bill!" he whispered. "Bill Wainford!" Was he dreaming? His head was reeling. It may have been a drunken fantasy. Then he heard the voice. "Slick!" He saw the glint of a knife in the intruder's hand. "Is this your place?" Slick shook his head, for the moment incapable of speech. "It belongs to a woman, doesn't it? Mrs. 𝒉𝒓𝒂𝒔. Funny, my wife had relations of that name. Are you, a friend of hers?" He picked up the hat he had dropped and put it on the sofa. Slick nodded. "You're the cat man, eh?" Wainford laughed softly. "Yes, it would have been bad luck if I'd been pinched. I only came out of Dartmoor 6 months ago. Can I have a drink?" Slick pointed to the decanter. "Don't talk too loudly," he said. Wainford looked round him as he was pouring out the whiskey. "Is anybody here, Mrs. 𝒉𝒓𝒂𝒔?" Again, Slick nodded. "She's as rich as the devil, isn't she?" "Don't talk so loud," Slick warned him again. The newcomer had many adventures, and he spoke of them with that old pitiable pride of his. He had reached America after his skip from Cambrai, got into trouble in Connecticut, and was jailed. When he came out, he fell into the association of a bank smasher and was caught again. Together they broke jail and got across to Canada. "Ever heard of Toby Lenz, the man who had held up the cashier in Leicester and got away with 3,000? That was me. They caught me on the next job. I got 3 years. "Fascinating," said Slick, and Wainford looked at him suspiciously. What are you doing? Slick smiled slowly. All the tricks you taught me, old boy. I'm the best pupil you ever had, Bill. The cards, eh? You haven't seen my wife? She's abroad, said Slick quickly. Good luck, said Wainford, raising his glass with an ironical gesture. She was a bit of a weeper. Still sweet on her? Slick did not answer the question. He indicated the door. You had better go while the going's good. I thought I'd leave, decorated with diamonds. Wainford was looking round the flat. He saw a photograph, and before Slick could stop him, he picked it up. Bunny, he whispered. Mrs. 𝒉𝒓𝒂𝒔. She's Bunny. Don't be a fool, said Slick. Wainford looked round at him with a sly smile. Don't be a fool, eh? Mrs. 𝒉𝒓𝒂𝒔 is the late Mrs. Wainford. I heard that this woman had changed her name when she came into the stuff, but I never guessed. She'll hear my voice in a minute. And then, extravagantly, and will come running into the arms of her loving husband. She'll hear nothing, said Slick quietly. There's a double door and a lobby beyond that. She thinks you're dead. Wainford smiled crookedly. She'll know I'm alive. $250,000, wasn't it? With all that money, old boy, we'll buy peace with the world, Monte and Egypt, and a nice quiet little flat somewhere up west. Eh? He chuckled. Slick's eyes did not leave him. The old life, with her money, is that the idea? He asked slowly. The old hunting crop and the girls, he whispered softly. Have you gone pious? Sneered Wainford. It was a mistake to have asked such a question. Slick had not gone pious. His mind at that moment was with the dead, the good fellows whom this man had deserted. Bill? His voice was very, very soft. You know what happens to deserters in the face of the enemy. They die. Wainford grinned at him. There's no war on now. Yes, there is, said Slick, and his voice was very, very low. I'm the enemy. You think you're going to Bunny, don't you? To break her heart all over again. He shook his head. You're going back into the dark where you belong, Bill. Do you think so? Hissed Wainford. As the other's hand reached for him, Slick saw the flick of a knife and caught the man by the wrist. For a second they swayed and struggled, and then... What happened? Slick never knew. Only he felt the man gripped in his arms go slack, saw the blood well over the white shirt front. Then he heard Bunny's voice. Who's there? Wainford had fallen on his knees, kneeling against him, a dead man. Slick had no doubt of that. Stooping, he lifted him, carried him to the sofa, and sat him in the corner, jamming a hat upon his head. Who is that man? Bunny was standing in the doorway leading to her bedroom. She wore a dressing gown hurriedly fastened over her nightclothes. Slick looked up stupidly. Hello, old friend of mine. We met after separation of years. Doesn't speak very much, he said with a grim humor. He'll never say anything or do anything to hurt you, Bunny. Bunny rang the bell. That's all right. Slick's voice was thick and drunken. He was talking to the dead man, lolling, his arms supporting. I've been telling her a lot of lies, old boy, and I've come back to apologize. All right, Bunny. He put a hand under the arm of the inanimate thing and lifted it. It was grotesquely alive, stupidly drunken. He dragged it as he walked unsteadily with his burden to the doorway. Good night, Bunny. Always a perfect gentleman. Outside, the fog was thicker than ever. He could cross the road, and there was a parapet that divided him from the river, where a dead man might drop quietly out of sight and be no more seen by him. He heard a splash, and then the chiming of Big Ben as it struck 12. Merry Christmas! He waved his hand toward where Bunny sat weeping in a room, somewhere at the back of the fog. The end.